Good vibrations.
Welcome to episode 128, and today we're continuing the theme of the military and intelligence services involvement in the popular music scene. It seems there are new layers to this being uncovered all the time, and so much of it has been sat right under our noses for the past several decades. But until you suspect that there's nefarious stuff to be found beneath the surface, you don't really have any reason to go looking. Because we're entrained to think of pop music as just light, fluffy entertainment, right? Rather than any kind of mind control. But when you're prepared to accept that there might be more to it, and you've got the diligence and the will to go digging into the research, it is astounding how much there is to back up the idea that the very creation of the entertainment industries in the first place was because of the colossal opportunities they presented to subliminally affect large numbers of people at a time. So my guest today has woven together lots of seemingly disparate strands, although you realise after a time that there's nothing disparate about it, everything is ultimately connected. But he's added many more facets to this story and really built upon some of the stuff that we've covered on previous episodes. So it's welcome to American-based independent researcher Sean McCann. Welcome, Sean.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
All right, so you reached out to me a while back. You said you'd seen my work and you had some stuff that you wanted to contribute along those lines, and you sent me some notes on it, and it was really great stuff. So I was very keen to have this conversation because what you've come up with certainly adds a lot of weight to things that we've discussed before. So I'm curious what it was that got you started in this area of research, because we were just saying off air that you're a regular dude with a 9-to-5 job, and this is something you've just taken on in your spare time. So you're like a citizen researcher. So what first made you suspect that there were things to be uncovered in this area and set you off on this path of research?
Well, I knew about Dave McGowan through your work and Jan Irvin and Hans Utter's work. I listened to all of the pretty much everything you've done in the last few years now. And while skateboarding down Music Row in Nashville with my dog, listening to a podcast, I realized that Music Row is Laurel Canyon is a B version of Music Row. Music Row came first. It's a little street with lots of little houses, fully dedicated to recording music, and it set the tone for the entire music industry of country music. And it dawned on me, and I thought, wow, I got to look into that. And I did, and I got a lot of stuff, and I made sure to contact you and tell you what I knew.
All right. Well, in this conversation, I want to get into military involvement in the creation of the record industry, and particularly the US Navy and their involvement in creating things like record shapes and sizes, formats and speeds and stuff like that. And also military-grade radio systems, which were later put to use in the mainstream arena. And there's parallels there with the creation of the FM radio format as well, which seems to be very much linked to the scene that came out of Laurel Canyon and the counterculture scene of the 1960s. FM radio was pretty much created as a vehicle for getting this new breed of rock music out to the masses. And there's military connections there as well. So I certainly want to get into all of that, but just staying with Music Row in Nashville then, what sort of time scale are we looking at for all of this? Would it be 1950s?
It was before the 1950s. It actually, RCA Studios, Studio B is really what kicked off Music Row. Studio B was built in 1956, I guess. So yeah, 56, you're right, the 50s for Studio B. Nashville itself was the center of country music long before that, with WSM, the Grand Ole Opry, and they had the Ryman Auditorium. And with this being it's like the New York of the South, it's the big city of the South, and they centered all of their music business there. So yeah, you're right. 1956, Studio B was where Elvis did most of his recording. It was most of it. It pioneered the Nashville sound, which was sophisticated style, they called it, with background vocals and strings. And it gave a new boost to country music, and it reintroduced country music again in the 50s for the record-buying public.
And what you were saying there about Music Row being centered around this one small area, just a small collection of streets, everything's compact, everything's contained, put me in mind of a couple of things. First of all is Laurel Canyon, which was a very kind of restricted, compact community in LA, just a few roads, just a few streets, and yet all these musicians and all these recording studios and sprung up in just that small area. And the other thing would be Tin Pan Alley in New York. I've just quickly looked that up on Wikipedia, and it says Tin Pan Alley is the name given to the collection of New York City music publishers and songwriters who dominated the popular music of the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th. The name originally referred to a specific place west 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues in the Flower District of Manhattan. So again, it's a very compact area where everything is on hand, nothing's too far away. Also, you can think of most towns and cities, certainly in the UK, it might be the same in the US, where all the bars and clubs and cafes and restaurants and all the night spots are situated in just a few streets, all clustered together in one area rather than being spread throughout the city centre. And the idea is to keep everything, manageable and controlled within one small area. So it seems to be the same concept that was being rolled out in all these different communities where aspects of the music industry were blowing up. It's far better to maintain control over it when it's all together in one place, right? There seems to be a system to it.
Yeah, precisely. I didn't know about Tin Pan Alley, and that makes sense. That would make Music Row a B version of that. So Laurel Canyon is just another in a long line of these.
Well, that's right. In your email to me, you were drawing parallels between Laurel Canyon and Music Row in Nashville, and you said they both have addicted, mind-controlled artists, they both created an entire scene, fashion, lifestyle, they both had direct military ties to family members, here we go again, of important artists, they both controlled and dominated radio for decades, they both introduced new technology for listening. Do you maybe want to get into who some of the key players were on Music Row then, and some of these family connections and some of the other stuff that we need to know about there?
Okay. Roy Acuff, I'll start with him. He was grandson to a senator, and basically there was a quote that said, if you want to draw power in the South, it's Roy Acuff, then God, which is extraordinary saying. Let's see here. I've got some... he was born in 1903, predominant family in Union County. Roy's paternal grandfather, Coram Acuff, was a Tennessee senator, and his father was a fiddler and Baptist preacher. In 1932, he was in Dr. Hauer's Medicine Show, which toured the southern Appalachian region, and hired Acuff. He would draw a crowd to sell medicines like snake oil, and he met legendary Appalachian banjoist Clarence Ashley, who taught him the song "House of the Rising Sun" and "Greenback Dollar," and the fact that he was trained for medicine shows, his loud voice worked really well for the new technology of microphones, where you had to really yell into them to get anything. He was one of the main. He started Acuff Rose, which is the most important publishing company of country music. They signed Hank Williams. He was initiated into the East Nashville Freemasonic Lodge in 1943. He taught President Nixon how to yo-yo. He's got a star in the Hall of Fame. Let's see that. Graham Parsons. He was a member of the Laurel Canyon scene, but he tried to cross genres into country to connect those two. He was the son of a military. Let's see. He was Ingram Cecil and Avis Connor were his parents. The mother was daughter of a citrus fruit magnate, John A. Snively, and Parsons' father was a famous World War II flying ace, decorated with air medal, and was present at the attack on Pearl Harbor.
I'd have been more surprised if his father hadn't had a military career, to be honest. If he turned out to have been a truck driver, I'd have been amazed.
Yeah, his father died when he was 12, and then his mother died when he was graduating high school, and he took the name of his stepfather. Graham Parsons was a real piece of work. He would he had money. He was a trust fund baby, so he didn't need to play good shows. He used to just get plastered on mushrooms and cocaine, and then people going to his shows would say that it wasn't even worth seeing because he was always too effed up at the time. He couldn't really play very well.
We've heard that one before. It's just like Jim Morrison all over again, isn't it? You know, his dad's the Admiral, he's involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. You got Graham Parsons, his dad's involved in Pearl Harbor. They both turn out to be these debased kind of musicians, exhibiting all kinds of crazy behavior. You know, it's just like the same old story, same old template, just being rolled out again.
Precisely it. It's the same book all over again, you know.
And Graham Parsons, there's this crazy story of he died at the age of... Did he not quite make the 27 club? I think he was 26. He was just shy of his 27th birthday. And so he died of an overdose, apparently. And his body was in a coffin at LAX airport, I believe, waiting to be transported. And a bunch of his mates stole the coffin, put it in a car, drove out to Joshua Tree Monument out in the desert, and ritually burnt his body on like a sacrificial altar just before the autumn equinox. You know, like you do. There's nothing unusual about that. That's what mates do all the time, right?
As you do, normal things.
Totally normal.
It's all usual.
Yeah, of course.
Everybody wants to be a rock star like that. Everybody wants to have their body stolen and ritually burned.
Quite right.
Let's see. I guess many politicians were like kind of playing country music on TV. Senator Byrd was on a show called Pop Goes the Country, and it's really like I said, President Nixon was yo-yoing with Roy Acuff. It was really it was more than just music. It was like it seemed as though country was for an entire lifestyle and an entire way of thinking. And I guess the military people were just good order followers that would do what they're told, and I guess
well, they tend to, yeah.
Let's see.
Just going back to Graham Parsons, you'd said that he had pretty much managed to bridge the gap between the folk rock sort of counterculture scene coming out of California and the country crowd, because the country music followers pretty much eschewed all of these hippie long hair bands, and they wanted nothing to do with that whole scene. But Graham Parsons, as a one-time member of the Byrds, was able to amend his music style somewhat and incorporate elements of folk rock fused with country to make himself more palatable to that whole country crowd, so that they were more keen to adopt him. And he was pretty much the only act that was able to have a foot in both camps.
Yes, actually, I saw the other day it's the 50th anniversary of Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which is the album that they recorded in Studio B, which is why they were invited to the Grand Ole Opry stage in the first place. And they had when this counterculture was happening in the 60s, the Opry maintained a straight-laced conservative image, and long hairs were not featured on the show. It was. I mean, they kicked out Hank Williams for being a drunkard. You know what I mean? They're not going to invite some long-haired hippies. And the crowd, when they did play, the crowd was hostile, yelling and heckling, and with mocking calls of tweet, tweet, and cut your hair. It was really a hostile thing, but they did it anyway. I mean, it was part of the program. They were supposed to play a Merle Haggard song, but then they played Hickory Wind instead. The Merle Haggard song was supposed to be Life in Prison, but they played Hickory Wind, which I think was their song. It really pissed everybody off, and they were never invited back.
Right. So some researchers contend that the country music scene sort of hides behind this veneer of Christian patriotism, and it apparently represents good, traditional, all-American values. But actually, when you get beneath that glossy surface and you reach the underbelly of the whole thing, it turns out that it's the most satanic of all the music genres, with trauma-based mind control absolutely rampant amongst its key artists, and all kinds of dark occult ritualistic stuff. How much of that has come through in your research?
Kathy O'Brien has said, quote, "The country music industry was very much a part of the CIA's criminal covert operations at the time." And she said that Wayne Cox, who I couldn't find anything about this Wayne Cox, but she says Wayne Cox subjected her to an occult ritual during which I was so traumatized that my suggestible mind accepted the program that Wayne Cox was imprinting on her. Ashley Judd and her mom Naomi Judd. Naomi Judd, her earliest memories are of being sexually abused. I don't mean to laugh, but I mean, Jesus Christ! Ashley Judd was raped by a family member she won't name. That basically, if you look at the beginning of country music, it started with the Carter family and wholesome, good-hearted family music. And as it progressed, you started to see Dolly Parton talking about how her husband cheats on her all the time, but whatever, I'm going to love him anyway. And you got Merle Haggard promoting, use of psychedelics, and you got Hank Williams, who is a full-on alcoholic drunkard, and those are the heroes. It starts with the Carter family, and the beginning of when radios first started coming into homes. Before that, everybody, it was American tradition to have lots of instruments around the house, and everybody picks one up and everybody sings together as a family, and it's a bonding experience. Then once you get electricity into their homes and you get this devil box, the radio, it's going to play way better music than you could ever play. And all you got to do is turn a knob. And then soon all the families were just sitting around the radio, listening with no instruments. And then they passively accept what's coming in. And they trust it. And they got FDR saying with the fireside chats, and they got the first serial programs of that start. It's same as television. There was serials every week, and people would listen, and it was so people started to trust what was coming through the radio, and what they gave us was Carter family and wholesome things that people would accept and people would allow. And then once that becomes custom, to have always on and to be listening to the radio all the time. Now all the cars have got them, and every house has a radio. Then they start to go downhill, and they start to drag us with it. You know, like I said, the Dolly Parton, her first hit was Dumb Blonde. I mean, come on. She's not a hero, you know what I mean? Like, everybody loves her, and she's a great person, beautiful heart. Like, still, I'm just saying, like, the way that the industry uses them and as faces, and, you know,
well,
like
I interviewed Fritz Springmeier a few years ago, who has really studied the whole area of trauma-based mind control, and he's worked with the deprogramming of former slaves and subjects of all this, you know, published books with him. And he was telling me a load of stuff about the country music scene, and particularly Dolly Parton, who is a real poster girl for that whole scene, and she really exemplifies and personifies the whole beta sex kitten image, the programmed multiple that's used as a sex slave and passed around the industry. You know, Marilyn Monroe is very much the blonde bombshell sort of archetype of that whole thing, but Dolly Parton would be another connected to that scene. And he was saying there was this one particular concert where she came out on stage with her handler right by her side, and just before the performance she put her hand on his in a way that slaves are taught to do with their handlers, and he'd learnt this from survivors that had told him this, and she called him daddy right there on stage in front of all these people. And he said, you know, this was a blatant exhibition of the mind control that goes on in that industry, but 99.999% of people watching it would have no idea that it's going on right there in plain sight, because the public persona is about as far removed from any kind of behaviour like that as it's possible to get in terms of how it's presented.
Yep. No one has eyes to see or ears to hear. Only the few, you know. Only the ones in the occult orders are going to see that. Or Fritz. Yeah. And God bless him. I love Fritz Springmeier. I met him at Free Your Mind. He's a fine gentleman.
So you mentioned the Carter family, and that was June Carter that came out of that, right? And she ended up being Johnny Cash's wife?
Yes, Johnny Cash's wife, June Carter, was a child when the Carter family started making music and putting it on the radio. She's the daughter of, God, I forget her. Her mother was the famous picking guitar player. I've got it in my notes here. And there was A.P. Carter and his wife, and then her sister, who was June Carter's mother. And so Johnny Cash grew up hearing June Carter as a child on the radio. And they were the same age. He was a kid too.
She was played by Reese Witherspoon in that movie Walk the Line. Johnny Cash was played by Joaquin Phoenix. That was a great movie, actually. I'm not sure how true to the fact it was, but it was certainly a good watch.
Right, yeah, great movie. And Reese Witherspoon is a Nashville native. I used to work for a Harley shop in Nashville, and we sold many motorcycles to her father, who's a doctor. Anyway, so because she's Nashville native, it makes sense that she's in the country music movie.
Right.
So, anyway, I guess I kind of wanted to talk about, I don't know where you wanted to go, but I kind of wanted to talk about the inception of radio broadcasting and the Navy, if you wanted to go there now.
Well, for sure. I certainly want to go there next. I've just got a couple of loose ends I want to tie up on the country thing before we move on. So you mentioned Johnny Cash there. Is there anything more about Johnny Cash that the public needs to know but doesn't, that you've uncovered?
I haven't found anything other than how fine of a musician he is and how great of a career he's had. I really haven't found anything as far as military connectedness. That's one that came up empty with Johnny Cash.
Okay. And Waylon Jennings is another name that came up in your mail as well. Yeah,
Waylon was, as I was saying, Waylon was part of the degeneration of the male father figure, and Waylon helped to make Dad seem like a crazy drunk who would just shoot a shotgun and go nuts, you know. I didn't. Yeah, I should have had more on Waylon. I apologize.
Oh, no worries. Another name that's come out of that scene in more recent times would be Billy Ray Cyrus, and of course his daughter is Miley Cyrus, and we don't need to say too much more about her because it's all been said and it's pretty self-evident what she's become and what she's being used to promote in the industry. But he made some comments to the mainstream media a few years ago saying how concerned he was at how his daughter had turned out. And it does kind of beg the question from the public, well, where were you, mate? You know, what were you doing? How did you allow her to become this way? Where was your parental guidance? But, you know, if you consider that whole scene is steeped in mind control and it's generational, then I suppose you don't really have too much option other than to go along with the program, and you're pretty much trapped in the whole thing. And what Miley Cyrus is being used for now is just pretty despicable.
Right. Yeah, and he's an example of a destroyed father. And then the cult gets the babies, you know. They go to school, they listen to music, they hate their parents, and they do whatever Miley Cyrus does, you know.
Yeah.
Wears a dildo on stage or whatever the hell she does, you know.
Yeah, dresses up as a baby and masturbates. Great stuff for preteen girls to see. Well done, Miley.
It's disgusting. Yeah, and Kesha, also from Nashville, that same genre of Miley Cyrus. She was ritualistically abused, sold her soul to Satan or whatever the heck she said, you know. It's still like it's very heavy in Nashville. It's there's monuments downtown that are in the shape of the Key of Solomon. There's Parthenon replica with full statue inside, gold plated. I mean, they go all out in Nashville. They really spent a lot of effort. It's like the DC of the South, I would say.
Wow. Where is Britney Spears out of? Somewhere down south, right?
I don't know where Britney Spears is from. I have no idea.
She's from down south somewhere. I should have researched
She's
that.
down south. Okay. Yeah, it's Disney there. I mean,
well, yeah.
Disney's a whole nother show.
Well, yeah, and there are connections, as we were saying off air, between the way the country scene is presented and the way Disney is presented, because they're both thought of as these great all-American institutions, wholesome, family-friendly. Right. They've got this respectable image, but you dig not too far beneath the surface and you discover the true nature of both these organizations, and it's anything but the way it's presented. It's classic satanic inversion once again. Exactly.
And if you look into I mean, the way that Studio B is constructed, it's got checkerboard floors, it has plexiglass pyramids hanging from the ceiling. I mean, there's it from the outside of the street looks like, it looks like a museum or whatever, and you get inside and it's all occult. You know, it's same with Disney. You know, it's occultism with a varnish of wholesome, you know, family friendly.
Yeah, just looked up Britney Spears. She was born in Macomb, Mississippi, and raised in Kentwood, Louisiana. So out of the South there.
Down south, you're right.
All right, well, we can segue into some of this military involvement in the radio and record industry at this point by looking at the Grand Ole Opry, because I know you had mentioned that, and that was recorded just a few blocks from Music Row in Nashville, connecting back into all of that. Listeners outside of the States, I think, might not be too familiar with what the Grand Ole Opry was, because I wasn't that au fait with it myself. Do you just want to break down to listeners what the Grand Ole Opry was and what the significance was of it?
Yeah, all right. Grand Ole Opry was... basically, it was a weekly country music stage concert, and it was founded in 1925, and it was the longest-running radio broadcast in history. It's, in quotes, the show that made country music famous, and it showcased a mix of famous singers contemporary chart toppers, performing country, folk, gospel, and comedic performances. In 1939, it debuted nationally on NBC radio, and it was moved to the Ryman Auditorium, which is downtown Nashville, in 1943. And the thing with the Grand Ole Opry and NBC radio, they were using 50,000 watts to blast it out of the South. The entire South, 30 states or more, were fully in range of the Grand Ole Opry every Saturday night. And these old radios and the beginning of broadcasting, it was all fuzz. On the entire dial, it was just fuzz, maybe a little bit of something, and all of a sudden, wham! Grand Ole Opry is full and clear and sounds beautiful, and they've got all kinds of amazing artists. So that's really what it popularized radios, having radios in your house so that you could listen to the Opry. And it was, like I said, a country music stage concert. The original name was a WSM barn dance. And in the old days, people used to go to barn dance on Saturday night to meet people and mingle, and it was a social occasion. And now they have this barn dance on their radio at home. They don't have to leave. They don't have to meet people. They stay in their little cubicle and they listen to their little box. It's really a feat of magic what they did to us.
Right. And these days everyone's walking around with these shitty little tinny earbuds plugged into their phones, walking around thinking that's the way to listen to music properly. So it's interesting that you get the very best in sound technology, in sonics, with a lot of these movements. So you had the Grand Ole Opry with the 50,000 watts of funkin' power pushing that all out, and then you could think of the counterculture scene coming out of California in the 60s with all these music festivals drenched in LSD and psychedelic rock, and they had these state-of-the-art sound systems. A lot of that was down to this guy Owsley Stanley, who, as well as being an LSD acid king pushing all the drugs, was also the sound system guy that installed all this really good stuff. And then you've got the invention of FM radio, as we said, which was connected with all this rock music that came out of that scene, and that method of radio seems to have been a way of getting all that music pushed out. So you get the very best technology as a means, as a vehicle for pushing out these new music scenes as they come along. And of course, it's all coming from military, government-related institutions, ultimately.
Right. And it was a further, with regular radio, it's mono. With the FM radio, you have both left and right hemispheres of the brain. It's much more effective with the mind control. So FM was perfect for what they were doing, even though it was unpopular at the time. But when they made rock music on the FM stations, it popularized it immediately. Pretty much FM's the only thing people listen to now. And if you look today, they've got video games and all, but they've got the virtual reality. It's a step on from past the TV, and how the mind control possibilities for that are endless. And I'm afraid of the future with that kind of thing. I'm going to be living in the woods probably.
Yeah, I'll be right there in the next cabin, 5 miles through the forest.
That's great, man. We can go to the barn dance on Saturday.
Hey, yeah. Grow mushrooms together.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, so let's move on to the Navy control of the radio industry, and also some of these big record companies like RCA.
Okay. Well, what really struck me was the logo, the Nipper dog, from RCA, and it just dawned on me one day what it is and what it represents. It's the It's the Victor Talking Machine Company device with the audio, with the phone pointing at this dog, and the dog is listening intently, and it's transfixed, and it says in quotes, "his master's voice." Right there was like, oh my God, like the population are the dog, and his master is the one speaking through this machine.
And which master are we talking about?
We're talking about the owners of the radio, the high occult masters that own the industry, and they are using suggestion programming to transfix us and to make us follow what they want, their orders.
Right.
So I guess I looked into RCA, and it's another one of those 3-letter companies that is a front for the government in a sense, like AIG and all these other. So RCA, I guess we'll start with Marconi invented the radio. So in 1894, Guglielmo Marconi used discontinuous waves to send Morse code messages through the air, and later he sent them across the Atlantic Ocean. In 97, the Wireless Telegraph and Signal Company Limited was founded in London to promote the inventions of Marconi. As a part of the worldwide expansion, American Marconi was organized in 1899, and it had patents, and it had the rights to use the Marconi patents in the U.S. and Cuba. In 1912, it took over the United Wireless Telegraph Company, and from then on, it was a dominant radio communication company in the U.S., but it was centered out of London. So that was kind of a point of contention for the military, for the Navy, the U.S. Navy.
Right.
When the U.S. entered World War I in April 1917, most civilian radio stations were taken over by the government. They were just taken to be used for the war effort. And the overall plan was to restore civilian ownership after the war, but many Navy officials hoped to retain the monopoly after the war. And during the war, defying instructions to the contrary, the Navy began purchasing large numbers of stations. When the war ended, Congress turned down the Navy's efforts to have peacetime control, and they were forced to sell the stations it controlled and the ones it had improperly purchased to the original owners. And national security considerations, the Navy was particularly concerned about returning the high-powered international stations to American Marconi because the majority of its stock was in foreign hands, and the British already controlled largely the undersea cables, the international cables. And also, it was in 1918, American Marconi was going to form the Pan American Wireless Telegraph Company, a joint venture with American Marconi and Federal Telegraph Company to have service between the U.S. and South America. And that was too much. The U.S. Navy wanted to maintain control, and so claiming it was acting with the support of President Wilson, looking for an alternative that would result in an all-American company taking over the American Marconi assets. In April 1919, two naval officers, Admiral H.G. Bullard and Commander S.C. Cooper, met with GE's president, Owen Young, asking that he suspend the pending alternator sales to the Marconi companies. So GE sold alternator pieces for the sets in that would run the radio, and this would leave General Electric without a buyer for these widgets, basically. And so the officers proposed that GE purchase American Marconi and use its assets to form its own radio communications subsidiary. And Young consented to their orders, and effective November 20th, 1919, it transformed American Marconi into the Radio Corporation of America, RCA. The new corporation was promoted as being a patriotic gesture, and their incorporation papers required that its officers needed to be U.S. citizens with a majority of stock held by Americans. So that's how RCA started. Basically, sure. The Navy said, okay, do this now, and GE complied.
Right. And you mentioned those two admirals, Bullard and Hooper, were always present at the RCA board meetings. They were always there, right?
Yes, that was President Woodrow Wilson appointed Rear Admiral Bullard, in quotes, to attend the stockholders and directors meetings in order to discuss informally the government's views and interests. They were at all the meetings, and well, at least Bullard was. And Cooper was also important, but they had to have the Navy attending all the meetings, and every decision was run by them, basically. Right. So they had control, but on paper it was an independent company.
And so out of the radio operation, we had the RCA record label coming along and putting out a whole bunch of pop music acts of the day.
Yeah, the RCA record production. RCA invented the 45. They set the groove depth and the speed of the record. I mean, they were the leader of the industry, basically. They had a little bit of competition, but it was nothing important, really. RCA was basically leading the charge, and everybody was following suit.
So they invented the 33 1/3 RPM speed for playing records on turntables. And 33 is an interesting number, of course, when you get into Freemasonry and secret societies and all that area of research. So of all the speeds it could have been calibrated to, it just happened to turn out as 33. Is that just coincidence, I wonder?
Yeah. Yeah, the more you look into it, the more you find things like that. Yeah. I mean, like I said, the hall of Studio B had checkerboard floors. I mean, and you had to be connected to be in this industry anyway, you know. Just like the military, if you're not a Mason, you don't get very high in the ranks.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess they were the first. RCA Victor introduced the first 33 1/3 record sold to the public. It was a commercial failure because the new playback equipment was expensive. The format, and it was 31, so considering the time of the Depression, the format was abandoned by 33, and 2-speed turntables were no longer sold. 33 was picked up later by a different company, and it was continued to be a common speed of turntables, but they were the start of 33, even though they abandoned it later.
I've got a pair of Technics SL1210 DJ turntables downstairs, which I've had for many years, and they are set to 33 and 45. After all these decades, those are still the standard speeds. There used to be a 16 and a 78 back in the day, but they were phased out, and 33 and 45 remain the standard after, 80-odd years.
RCA marketed the 45 as a direct replacement for 10-inch and 12-inch 78 RPM records, which typically played about 3 or 4 minutes on each side. RCA also released some extended play EP 45s with playing times up to 7 minutes. But yeah, they were a direct replacement. So it was phased out by RCA. They are the culprits.
Right. With a lot of the other big record labels of the day, contemporary with RCA, the likes of Decca, Parlophone, EMI, a lot of these companies had links going back into military research, work on radio systems and sonar and stuff like that. One of them was Thorn EMI. You had the record label coming out of the electronics division. And one of the employees for Thorn EMI, it turns out, was one Roger Webb. His son was Harry Webb, who's better known as Cliff Richard. He emerged in the late 1950s as this British rock and roll star, very much modelled on the image of Elvis Presley. So how interesting that we have another high-profile music act coming out of one of these companies that has a background in military research.
Wow. Yeah, that's another example of how business leaders and the owners' children are the ones that are the stars.
Exactly.
They don't want to let the control be given to anyone else. They want to have full control.
Exactly. Keep it in the family.
What Daddy says.
Yeah. So what's interesting is you had Cliff Richard coming out in 1958 with his debut single "Move It," fashioned in the image of Elvis Presley, as I said. And there were other British singers that came with that kind of image at that time as well, pushing a British take on American rock and roll. One of them was Marty Wilde, who's the father of Kim Wilde. There we go again. Kim Wilde, the pop singer. Her dad was a rock and roll star in the late 1950s, real name Reginald Smith, but he became Marty Wilde. And this, to me, just highlights the complicity between the American and the British markets, because you had scenes blowing up simultaneously in both countries, and you had acts that were pushing the same kind of imagery and the same styles and the same social dynamics. Then a few years later, you can look at what was dubbed the British Invasion, where you had the Beatles and all these other groups coming out of the UK that were being marketed and pushed and becoming very popular in the US. And what they were actually doing was taking American rhythm and blues records and repackaging them, giving them a British twist, and then selling them back to the American market. And that's kind of the reverse of the likes of Cliff Richard and Marty Wilde, that were taking American R&B, rock and roll, and fashioning that for the British general public. So Britain and America seem to have been working together all along through these different companies and these different aspects of military intelligence. And it highlights to me how America never really shook itself free of Britain in 1776. Basically, the control has been there all along.
I mean, if you look at I mean, in the beginning, apparently Britain was trying to I mean, Britain never thought of us as being free. Like, if you look at the way that they do their business, and I mean, with the round table groups and the secret societies, I mean, they have control over all of it, and we all know that from other research. But Britain really, it seems as though America, Canada, Australia, everything is still under full control, even though they say it's not. Like when the Roman Empire was over, all of a sudden we had a pope and religion. They still had full control over the planet, but the Roman Empire was destroyed, in quotes, Right. It's just another way of maintaining control. And it makes sense that Britain and America are working together on this mind control project, of radio and music. And the fact that they take Elvis Presley, Elvis did the bulk of his recordings at Studio B in RCA Studios, Music Row. Like, they created Elvis, and Elvis was, kind of helped spark the country genre of the wholesome, hardworking type of American. And then British comes a few years later with the alternative to that, to create the polarity of long hairs and blue collar, Right. That way they can crash them against each other and have more division and more, more control over us, in a sense. I guess they have more power because they are more organized, and our people are busy hating each other, just like they do now all the time.
It's the creation of dialectics, which they do all the time, control both sides of a dialectic. It's the same thing as with religion. It doesn't matter whether you're somebody that subscribes to one of these dogmatic religious belief systems that comes with rules and regulations and codes and guidelines that you have to adhere strictly to, or if you're someone who's an atheist who denies the existence of any kind of spirituality, any kind of Godhead, any kind of divine. They've got you either way, because both of these systems keep you away from true spirituality and exploring the truth of our connectedness to, creation and the divine and us being aspects of it. They've got you either way. That's what they do with these dialectics. It's the same as the two-party political system as well, right?
Right. And because the dialectic is so enforced by the culture and everyone around you, people can't even imagine a third choice.
That's right.
It's blinding.
Right. And the CIA has been working in conjunction with British military intelligence forever. You've got the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner to the CIA, which was set up with various members of the British establishment. That guy Gregory Bateson was one. And so the CIA comes about. Then a short while later, you've got Aldous Huxley, another piece of the British establishment furniture, the eugenicist from that notorious family, who becomes a co-architect of the CIA's MKUltra program and is heavily involved in advising that whole thing. So there's just complete cooperation between British military intelligence, MI5, MI6, Tavistock Institute, and what emerged in America. And we even see this in the James Bond stories, the James Bond novels and films, where you've got Bond as a member of MI5, British Secret Service, and his buddy is Felix Leiter of the CIA, and they knock about together and cooperate together on missions. So they're telling you right there in those stories what goes on and the close links that there are between these two seemingly different and far removed institutions.
Right. Yeah, like the OSS was built by it was built by British military. It was given to us basically, and then it was taken over and turned into CIA. And if you look at the Rhodes Scholars, and their mission is full domination of the planet, and you basically all the roundtable groups work the same orders. Basically, it's what did John Dee call it? Rule Britannia,
So another note that you had sent me was concerning the US government's electrification of the South with the Rural Electrification and Telephone Act of 1936. Do you want to get into what that's all about?
But I haven't said that yet, but it is very important because that's the entire market of where the Grand Ole Opry was broadcasting. The South was very sparsely populated, and no one had electricity because the electricity at the time didn't have enough power to get all the way down to the rural areas. They could cover the cities, but they didn't have enough juice to get it everywhere else. And with new technology and different transformers on the houses, they were able to amp it up and really push it out to the rural areas. And if you look at what the Amish said, no. Yeah, the Amish had seemingly, if you look at them now, they are seemingly free of Babylon. They don't have to deal with the evil of our society, and it's no problem for them. They're still living the way that they choose, and they don't have outside influence. And if you look at the beginning of the Rural Electrification Act, everybody was living like Amish people. Everybody was, they had a barn, they had their animals, they didn't have Babylon. You know what I mean? They didn't have the evil culture. I guess the Amish call it the English. They don't have the English in quotes. But so the Rural Electrification Act of 1936, it was a New Deal, like the whole New Deal wave of FDR's New Deal, where he's trying to employ people, trying to, repair after the Depression. And they wanted to electrify all the rural areas. They made it as if you need to have electricity because kerosene lamps are dangerous, and they made it a safety thing, and they just pushed it into law, stamped, signed, and every barn was to have a light bulb, every kitchen was to have a light bulb, and they were going to wire the South. And you couldn't say anything about it. They were just doing it. You couldn't be like, no, I don't want it. I mean, the Amish did, but everybody was under the impression, oh, this will improve my life, and this is the new future way, and all of that. So they just electrified the entire South in 1936, and then 1939, I think, Grand Ole Opry was being broadcast on NBC at 50,000 watts. So it all goes like one step, next step, along with the mind control.
Yeah, incrementalism.
Exactly.
And one of the things that the early US radio industry was used for was FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats, which was government propaganda, straight up. Big shout to Greg Carlwood, by the way, on the higher side chats. But the fireside chats was just a way of utilising the fact that everyone had a radio set in their homes to get this state propaganda into their minds. And we've had a similar institution here in Britain for God knows how many years, decades, with the Queen and her Christmas message. So every Christmas day at about 3 o'clock, when everyone's all bloated and stuffed up on turkey and is vegetating away in their armchair, the Queen comes on and delivers this message, which probably somebody else wrote in like June or something, and she's just reading it out. But it's more propaganda, it's more mind control, and the state broadcasting system is used for that purpose as well. So they'll never miss a chance to get the official establishment line on things put out there via these methods.
Tired and tripping from their tryptophan and their turkeys.
Exactly.
They're all like suggestible. They're listening to whatever the Queen whatever drivel she wants to drive into your mind. Right. There's the direct influence of having FDR's voice directly saying what he wants you to think. And then there's the subliminal, subconscious, indirect programming that is also possible with this technology. And I mean, I'm sure they were chomping at the bit, waiting to get this radio. I mean, that's why the Navy wanted to maintain the monopoly of all radio stations. They were like, no, this is great. We're going to keep this. And the U.S. government said, no, sorry. But still, in a sense, they did keep it with RCA and everything after.
Do you feel that the radio industry is largely obsolete now as a result of the internet? Because any FM station that's broadcasting via that means is also going to be streaming live on the internet. So it's like FM isn't really needed anymore. Is there a sense in which this is a technology which has had its day, it's pretty much done, it served its purpose when it was around, but now it's all digital, electronic, online, and that's the way things are getting done now? It's all just moved on.
I agree with that. I think that's the case. I mean, I hope people stop listening to the radio because there's nothing good on the. There's nothing good, and
not now, no.
For years, But I'm sure that the occult programmers are fine with that because they got VR and the internet and video games and TV still. TV's still pumping hard. Everybody's still watching TV every day, so. I think the radio was like a step in the ladder, up the technology scale. And now the new tech with our technocracy that's rolling in and 5G and wired everything in your house, like
smart grid, yeah.
Smart grid, exactly. Like that's the next wave. And looking at what happened with the radio and with the Rural Electrification Act, I mean, we can see what they're going to do with it. It's going to be the same thing. They're going to keep doing the same that they've always done. They just got better tools now.
That's right. They just use whatever technology is available at the time to get the job done. And as times move on and technology changes, they just switch it up and use different methods. And whatever's required to get the job done at that particular time gets used.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Is there anything we didn't cover that we really should? Or is that pretty much it?
Well, I I guess I believe we've spoken on a lot of things. Basically, I just wanted to get across how the devolving of our society had taken place, and that's really what the main goal was, and it's not, it's never to make money. They make the money. They create the money. They don't need it. The real goal is to occupy our minds and to have us under their control. And really, that's what all the technology's doing, and that's what the radio had done. And we can use this information to see the future and make educated guess.
Well, you've come with some good information there, and I feel this is a very valuable area of research that some of us are now doing, and it's incredible that we're uncovering and presenting information that's remained largely hidden from public scrutiny for several decades. And it is important because, first of all, everything we present is all verifiable. People can go out and check it for themselves, make sure we're not just pulling the stuff out of our arses, It's all right there in the public domain, and bringing it all together in this way gives people an opportunity to understand how entertainment and culture has been weaponized to catch us off our guard. And the more people that understand this, the more the controller's level of influence is diminished, and the more chance people stand of being able to make better informed decisions for themselves. Because there's some researchers in the conspiracy realm that will say, you guys are wasting your time going back over the past, you should be focusing on what's happening now and all the threats facing humanity, transhumanism and 5G and all this. And I do get into that, but I do think it's important to learn lessons from the past and apply them to the present, because if you can break the mind control, then you can move forward to a much better situation for all of humanity once you learn about what has been weaponized against you.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. People like that, I always tell them, well, that's your research. You go do that research. I'm doing this. Right. I want to talk about this, And when they want to talk about like transhumanism and shit, I'll talk about that, also. But yeah. I'm interested in this right now, and I'm doing that. And I have my own free will. You know what I mean? Well,
there's not that many of us doing this, so it's good that some of us have taken up the mantle. You know what I mean?
Right. Thanks, man. I appreciate that, and I'm glad to do the work, and I'm happy to learn more. I'm gonna keep digging.
Great stuff. And in terms of the information you've presented today, do you plan to bring all that together in one place, whether that's in the form of a book or a documentary film or a podcast or a live presentation or whatever?
Well, that's a good question. I was thinking about doing a podcast, and I've got all kinds of irons in the fire. I'm researching Kubrick and Crowley, and I don't know. It would be good to have a place to document it, have it sealed, clean, and be able to reference it to people, send them a link, show them my what my theories are, my thoughts. Sure. So I'm thinking maybe a podcast, and hopefully if that happens, I would love to have you as a guest, maybe someday. But
yeah, that'd be good. That'd be good.
That's great.
In the meantime, people will just have to make do with this podcast, right, until something else comes along.
I'll be listening every week, All
right. Is there anywhere online that people can check out any of your work so far, or is it still too early days for all of that?
It's pretty early days for my work. I used to have a website for my photography, but that is long gone. Life has kind of been an adventure for me, and I haven't really been able to do anything. But this is a good step in the right direction, and hopefully I'll start a website, and I'll get things rolling, because my brain's always working, and I'm always thinking, and I'm not watching TV, and so I'd like to learn the real and see what's actually happening.
Well, it's a great thing to do with your downtime as well. A lot of guys just go to the ball game or go and get drunk with their friends, or just, do whatever, just hang out and waste time. I think this is a worthwhile thing to do with your spare time, because it actually has some beneficial value to the rest of humanity.
Thank you. Yeah, it helps to fight the mind control that we're all subjected to.
That's right.
That's my main enemy.
All right, Sean, thanks for coming on today, man.
Oh, I love you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
This is just for fun.
Vibrations, I'm picking up vibrations, I'm picking up vibrations, I'm picking up